and I appreciate everybody's participation. And after hearing the first 3 sessions discussing water issues related to COVID, sustainabilities in municipalities, we take the conversation to the next logical step. And that is we move to consider the sustainability trends in codes and standards. In this next session, we're going to hear from a codes and standards expert on the shift in codes and standards to address sustainability issues. David Purkiss is the Vice President of the NSF International Global Water Division. David has over 30 years of experience in all aspects of water treatment and distribution systems. He leads NSF International Global Water programs, including offices in the US, Belgium, China, India, Korea, and the UK. These teams, his teams, deliver certification programs that help ensure the quality and safety of products used in municipal water treatment, water distribution, residential drinking water treatment, plumbing, pools, spas, and wastewater treatment. Since joining NSF in 1987, Mr. Purkiss has worked on many major initiatives, including assisting in the development of NSF standards and certification programs, including the certification of plumbing products, such as faucets and mechanical and plastic plumbing parts, to national and international standards. David, thank you very much for joining us. I know our folks are very interested in hearing what's going on at NSF in the codes and standard world, particularly as it relates to what's going on in the current climate. Thank you for joining us very much today, David.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. So this afternoon, I'll share with you some trends in codes and standards for drinking water products, such as pipe and fittings, as well as things that influence that sustainability initiatives are having on the codes and standards. Can everyone hear me okay? So on to
Yep, you're doing great, David. Everything's good.
Okay. So first, I'll provide some background on the regulatory structure for products used in the public drinking water systems and building plumbing systems, because those are regulated in 2 separate ways. We'll also look at the acceptance of plastic pipe and products in current codes and the general trend to harmonize international standards. We'll take a look at microplastics and lead, and at the increase in voluntary and regulatory requirements for water conservation. And finally, we'll look at how water conservation and other sustainability efforts can sometimes have unintended effects on microbial contamination and what can be done to counter that. So next slide. So water pipe and equipment used in centralized public drinking water systems are regulated by the US EPA, and requirements for products like PVC pipe are stipulated in state drinking water regulations. While water pipe and fittings that are used in buildings are regulated at the state, county, or local level through plumbing codes. And there are tens of thousands of plumbing jurisdictions in the US, but fortunately, most local codes are based on one of the 2 model plumbing codes, the UPC, the Uniform Plumbing Code, or the IPC, the International Plumbing Code. So next slide. And the good news for the plastics industry is that the model codes are becoming more pro-plastic. The international plumbing codes have been very accepting of plastics for the past decade or so, and many of the restrictions on plastics from the Uniform Plumbing Code have been lifted. One of the most recent examples of a restriction that was lifted is related to cured-in-place pipe liners. So these plastic liners were restricted from being used to repair cast iron drain pipe. And this was backed by an effort to encourage replacement of cast iron rather than using plastics. So this decision was appealed by the National Association of Sewer Service Companies with the IAPMO Board of Directors, and the restriction was lifted. So I think that's a positive trend. I believe it's getting harder and harder to impose restrictions on plastics for political reasons. But I'd certainly like to hear about your experiences as well. So next slide. And when it comes to the development of the model plumbing codes, the size of the room has been changing. Over the last decade, the number of people attending the code hearings has been declining. And generally, if you're in the room, you're in a position to be influential. If you're not in the room, you're leaving your fate to others. And the plastics industry has been very well represented over the last few decades, and that involvement has paid off. And now, with all meetings becoming virtual, the size of the room could potentially grow again because participation becomes easier and less expensive to have your voice heard. Next slide. A significant trend in standards development has been the international harmonization. In the water industry, that started with a push by manufacturers to encourage harmonization requirements of existing standards on both the US and Canadian sides. Now, this tends to be a slow but ongoing process. The Standards Council of Canada has recently expanded the number of standard development organizations that are accredited to write Canadian national standards. SEC encouraged US standards development organizations to write Canadian standards so long as they have a documented mechanism for Canadian involvement and participation. So NSF Standard 61, Drinking Water System Components Health Effects, has been an American national standard for decades, but in 2019, it also became a Canadian national standard. And that trend certainly will continue. Next slide. So microplastics, that's been an issue in the media with implications against both bottled water as well as surface runoff and wastewater effluent. The World Health Organization did a study in 2019 that found no grounds for concern. So this is probably not an issue for the codes at this point. I should mention, though, the NSF Committee for Drinking Water Treatment Unit Standards, which covers the development of standards for point-of-use water filters, they did form a task group to develop requirements for products that claim to remove microplastics. So if you're interested in that effort and would like to participate in the committee or just stay informed on developments, send me an email and I can get you looped into those task group meetings. Next slide. And the task group also slightly modified the WHO definition of microplastics, limiting it to particles between 1 micron and 5 millimeters in length in each dimension. So next slide. So NSF has developed several quote unquote sustainability standards for products ranging from carpet to wall coverings to roofing. And as you know, sustainability addresses a combination of economic, environmental, and social issues. So these standards contain requirements for the product, such as life cycle assessment, content requirements, contamination tests, durability tests, and other things that you would expect in a product standard. But what makes them different is they also have sustainable practices for facilities. So it addresses such issues as renewable energy resources, are there greenhouse gas emissions, what is the waste minimization, in fact, what is the impact of that production facility on the local community? And it can also address HR practices. And then the facility and product are awarded points for each category. And based on that point total, you can achieve a silver, gold, or platinum rating. Now, there's been minimal interest from industries in obtaining those certifications. And so far, none of these sustainability standards have ended up in regulations or codes. And I think that trend will continue, that the codes will focus on the product requirements and not get into the corporate requirements, the social and the HR practices of sustainability. But I might be wrong, but that's the trend I see. Now, where standards are needed is for new applications that come as a result of sustainability efforts. So in this slide for geothermal application of plastic pipe, in an effort to reduce costs and conserve energy, many production facilities have switched to geothermal heating and cooling, which can provide significant energy savings. So in this case, it was a new application of plastic pipe, so standards were created. But in this case, the standard is just setting minimum requirements for the product and not sustainability efforts of the company. So next slide. There's also a new ASTM standard that I know some of you are aware of for occupational exposure. And this is addressing the potential human health risks from exposure to chemicals and building materials. Now for this, I'm not really sure what the future will hold because there's two issues. One, have all the chemicals of concern been identified? And with supply chains being several layers deep for many materials, how do you know if a certain ingredient hasn't been changed or contaminated? So that's one challenge. The other challenge is making sure you have the toxicology data and the toxicology risk assessments for specific exposure levels for those specific chemicals. So there's an awful lot of information that would need to be brought together before you could make a practical assessment using this standard. So I don't expect to see it in the codes anytime soon, but we'll see. Lead continues to be an issue, has been for most of my career in the plumbing codes, although it's an issue that plastic pipe manufacturers addressed early on with banning lead stabilizers. But brass water fittings were allowed in federal law to have up to an 8% lead content until that was lowered to 0.25% in 2014. The US EPA recently issued regulations allowing them to enforce this, which will require manufacturers to have products third-party certified to the low lead criteria, which is stipulated in NSF Standard 372. Now, the thing is, California and many other states had adopted similar regulations dating all the way back to 2010. So the vast majority of plumbing products on the market today are in compliance with this, so it really won't have that much of an effect. But the other change with respect to lead is the NSF 61 standard, which covers the leaching of chemicals from water contact products and materials. The lead exposure levels for those have been changed from 5 micrograms to 1 micrograms for faucets, drinking fountains, and other fittings that dispense drinking water. And that change was just made to the 2020 version of Standard 61, and it goes into effect in 3 years. Next slide. So increasing water conservation is a growing trend in standards and codes. And today, plumbing products are covered by 3 different agencies. The US Department of Energy establishes flow rate requirements, and those requirements are equivalent to the ASME and CSA standards in the US and Canada. And the DOE is a mandatory national law. There's also US EPA WaterSense, which is a voluntary water conservation program that has set requirements that are a little stricter than the DOE. And then finally, there's the California Energy Commission, which established very strict low flow rate requirements for faucets sold in California, and many other states are adopting similar requirements. So next slide. So this table compares the flow rate requirements for various faucets for the various schemes. So you can see the Department of Energy has flow rate requirements equivalent to the US and Canadian standards, ASME and CSA. The California Energy Commission has the strictest flow rate requirements, and then in between is the voluntary WaterSense requirements. And WaterSense is a partnership program with the EPA and the manufacturer. And WaterSense has developed several criteria that you can certify products to meet the water conservation requirements. Next slide. And the product manufacturer enters into a WaterSense partnership agreement with the EPA. And under that agreement, manufacturers have 12 months to obtain certification of the product to the WaterSense specification. And next slide. And you can have that water product certified to the EPA requirements by an EPA licensed certifying body. And NSF, IAPMO, and other plumbing product certifiers are licensed now to do the EPA WaterSense certification. And the next slide on the California Energy Commission. CEC is the division of the California Natural Resources Agency, and their prime responsibility is maintenance of the California Energy Code, which also addresses water use requirements. So next slide. So several years ago, the governor of California signed an executive order mandating statewide water use reductions. The CEC then responded by lowering the maximum flow rate requirement for all these products sold in California. And so while we can all support water conservation, there are some potential problems with these lower flow rates. And so lower flow rates in piping that was designed for twice the current flow can lead to stagnation and longer water age in a building. And the longer the water sits there, the more it tends to ambient temperature. So the cold water becomes warm, the hot water becomes warm. There's less chlorine residual in the water. And so it's a perfect environment for the growth of microorganisms. And that can result in Legionella outbreaks. We've also seen similar problems recently with buildings that were shut down temporarily in response to COVID-19. So next slide. So Legionella is the #1 cause of waterborne disease outbreaks in the US. There were 10,000 reported cases of Legionnaire's disease in 2018. The Legionella bacteria is found naturally in soil, surface water, and groundwater. And over 60 different species of Legionella have been identified to date. Next slide. And you can see that the increasing rate of infections has increased year on year, with 2018 recording 10,000 or so cases. However, the National Academy of Sciences has estimated that the actual disease burden is about 10 times higher than the reported disease occurrence. So there could be about 100,000 cases of Legionella per year. And if you go to the next slide, it really compares the risk factors and symptoms for Legionella and COVID. And what you find is they're very, very similar. The risk factors are for the elderly, people with pre-existing lung conditions, smokers and former smokers. Those are the most susceptible. And the symptoms are virtually identical. It's a cough, it's fever, shortness of breath, pneumonia-like symptoms. The good news for Legionella is it can be addressed with antibiotics, whereas COVID-19 cannot. But there is a growing co-infection rate of individuals that either come down with COVID or Legionella and then go to the hospital and pick up the other disease, which then of course requires alternate treatment, requires the antibiotics if you have Legionella. So next slide. So the key to control is really controlling the water quality. Legionella thrives in warm water. So the key to prevention is to keep hot water hot, cold water cold, and keep residual levels of chlorine at effective levels. And the CDC in their investigations of outbreaks have determined that at least 9 out of 10 outbreaks could be preventable, easily preventable, with effective water management plans. And the World Health Organization has drafted water safety plan guidelines for buildings to develop these plans to manage the control of microorganisms. Next slide. And the CDC, the EPA, as well as NSF have information on our websites that can help you manage the water systems in your facility. And next slide. And I mentioned NSF has information as well addressing the management of building water systems, and also if you need to start up a building that's been dormant for a while. And then finally on to conclusions. So really looking at the trends in codes and standards, sustainability of products and manufacturers may never be directly mandated by the codes, but you can be sure that certain parameters of sustainability, such as energy and water conservation and chemical and microbial contamination, certainly will. And then the final slide. So that's what I have for you today, but I'm certainly willing to take your questions. And again, my email address, if you have questions later on, don't hesitate to contact me. And also, if you'd like to be involved in that microplastics task group for the point of use water filters, just drop me an email and we can get you set up on that group.
Okay, fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Dave, for sharing all of that great information. While we're collecting some questions, and I'm sure some folks in the audience are going to have some things to respond to there, I've got a few myself.
Sure.
You know, one in particular, similar to what Christina Davenport just presented a little while ago. Your presentation noted the unintended consequences of water conservation efforts.
Right.
So in general, you know, this continues to be a dilemma for our industry, where a lot of times hazard-based approaches to sustainability in one area could lead to unintended consequences in others, which could negatively impact public health or climate health or even economic equality. So my question is, to what extent does NSF seek to ensure a comprehensive multi-attribute approach to developing these sorts of sustainability standards to ensure that those risk factors can be properly mitigated and avoided?
Yeah, absolutely. It's crucial because you know, water conservation is important, but if you're putting in those water conservation measures, you also have to have the remediation measures in place for any of the unintended ill effects. So you know, the problem is pipe sizing hasn't changed for, you know, 50, 75 years. Pipes are still the same size, and yet the amount of water going through the pipes in buildings today is half of what it was 50 years ago. And so we need to change, you know, downsize the pipe size so the water continues to flow through. But obviously that would take a lot to remediate all the buildings, right, in the United States. So it just, you know, if then you know you have that condition, then you have to keep the water circulating, and you need to make sure that temperatures are maintained, the cold water's cold, the hot water's hot, and that you have disinfectant measures in place. And so as we're writing these things into codes and standards, you know, the remediation measures need to go there hand in hand.
Would you say the same philosophy applies to some of the other standards, the sustainability standards you listed for flooring and for wall coverings and the others, where it's a comprehensive multi-attribute approach? And would it be difficult for someone to come in and write a deselection based standard, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think for those standards, there's not, you know, the high impact unintended consequences that we see with Legionella, right? So I think for those there are, you know, and for those standards as well, for a manufacturer, they have the 3 tiers, and so it's kind of set up that way so that you can really address all your product requirements up front and get your silver, right, certificate, and then work on the more corporate sustainability issues to move up to the higher grades.
Great. Regarding microplastics, we at the VI have been collaborating very closely with EPA staffers and researchers in anticipation of emerging restrictions in both the US and Canada, really getting out ahead of this issue. And I feel like we're collaborating very well. The biggest issue that we're finding already is really, I think you noted it, is a poor weight of evidence in some cases, just, a lot of missing gaps in what we know about, what's happening really in terms of microplastics in general. And so, really trying to avoid where, there's a lot of premature conclusions that are being developed and hazard-based assessments being developed. We're really trying to get ahead of this and make sure we're understanding where the science is going and how, the test methods are being developed. So we would be very interested in participating on the task group, assuming that new microplastics related standards could be developed, whether as a component standard to NSF 61 or possibly in conjunction with ASTM and what's going on with EPA. My question is, to what extent will NSF advocate for the adoption of its own standards into those regulatory frameworks as opposed to the ICC and some of the codes?
Yeah, certainly if they can benefit those regulatory codes, we can do that. That could be a very useful thing. I think, you said, really need to take a hard look at all the research that's gone on, because, the WHO mentioned that in some cases there were research programs that indicted microplastics and said it's a real problem, but they couldn't really be sure that the small particles they were looking at were plastics, right? It might have been grains of sand. So we really need the science, and we need, robust methods in place. And certainly if NSF can help towards that end, we would certainly be willing to work and then advocate for adoption of those standards.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to make sure if anybody else had any questions before I continue to ask any of my own. I see that Rich Kroc has a question about ASTM and the occupant exposure screening report. I know we've discussed this previously. Thanks for bringing this up. One of the key concerns that you identified is that, potentially it may not be robust enough, if I could paraphrase what you said. Can you?
I think it's
go ahead.
robust from what I've seen, and I've just reviewed it a couple of times. But the issue for me is just, I don't know how practical it's going to be, just because there's a lot of information you have to pull together as far as all of the chemical hazards, identifying all of those. And the only way I can see that, because you don't know what your supplier's done, right, to these things where you might have chemical contaminants that you wouldn't expect. The only way you're going to determine that is by testing. And I don't know if people are going to be willing to do a lot of testing to identify those chemicals. So identifying all those chemicals is one mountain to climb, and then making sure you have all the toxicity risk assessments in place for those chemicals at the actual exposure levels that you again need to measure as well. So it's certainly it's an important issue. I think it's a very scientific approach to the issue, so I think that's good. It's just it's going to take a lot of work to get that information.
Yes. I think one last question would be kind of maybe a little bit more forward thinking. Water reuse and emerging water treatment technologies, they ensure cleaner effluent streams. All that fits really well with the Vinyl Sustainability Council and our emissions task force goal to reduce emissions to water. So how is NSF driving the adoption of water reuse systems and emerging technology in water that would, I think, certainly benefit from using vinyl in those systems? And then also, what advice would you give to vinyl industry members who want to get involved in developing really these new standards, like the geothermal standard you talked about, as it pertains to reuse and some other technology?
Yeah, so certainly on water reuse, we have developed the 350 series to address the efficacy of water reuse systems. There's improvements that could be made, frankly, to those standards to make them more robust. I mean, it was first drafted probably 10, 15 years ago. But I think that those are certainly tools that can be used in this effort. And certainly I would encourage everyone to get involved in the NSF standards activities, whether it's that microplastics task group or in water reuse. We can give you information on when those committees meet. Even before COVID, all of our meetings were essentially over the phone and Zoom and Skype. So that continues. So if you'd like to be on the committee, and signing up for the committee, even if you don't participate, you'll still get email updates on the progress of the task groups. So I'd encourage everyone to send an email to me with your contact details and which group you'd like to be on, whether it's the wastewater committee or this microplastics task group, and we'll get you set up.
Thank you so much, Dave. Really appreciate your time today, and thank you for the excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you, Dom. I really enjoyed it and appreciate the opportunity.
Great,
Thanks,
thanks.
Ned.
David, thank you very much for the conversation. That was fantastic, exactly what we had expected. And one of the reasons it's on this program today is that everyone knows codes and standards are critical and also critical to our industry. And we appreciate the partnership and engagement that we have on these very technical issues, and we really appreciate it. It's make or break for our industry, and we appreciate it.